I think that forgiveness in a lot of ways is a gift you give yourself, because when we harbor resentment in our hearts or harbor things towards someone else, it affects us even more than it does us. We spend more time focusing on them than they probably think about us because we're holding on to that. And so forgiveness is just that release of a debt that is owed you. You expect to be paid back to you somehow. And that can only be done sometimes looking at the cross of Christ. And when Jesus died on the cross and he said, "It is finished," that was in the Greek a merchant term, which literally can mean the debt has been paid. And sometimes I have to go back to that when I want to see the debt paid by the person that's hurt me, and be reminded Jesus has paid this debt. I don't have to keep waiting for this person to acknowledge the way they've hurt me or what they've done. So that I think is a picture of what forgiveness is supposed to be. Part of forgiveness, when we are offended or we are hurt by someone else, our eyes have to be taken off that person and put back on the Lord and say, "God, you are sovereign in the circumstances that you allow me to live in, and or work with, or whatever the issue is where the hurt is coming from. And so, Lord, my eyes are upon you." And if that person's in authority over you, if it's as a wife, to be able to say back, "God, I am trusting that you are going to work in this situation, that your job, your responsibility is to deal in the husband's life. It's not the wife's place to do that." And that it makes it, I think, an easier road to be able to forgive if you, as a wife, you feel like that you're continually being walked over or something by your husband, is to be reminded God is the one that I ultimately am responding to.
The one thought as you were sharing that I had is that forgiveness is on the inside. The doormat's on the outside. And there's a difference in the two. On the inside, we have to be careful to make sure that our hearts are right, that we are forgiven, that there's nothing of bitterness, that we're not letting a hurt rule and reign in our lives, but we're letting Christ's grace and mercy rule and reign in our lives. The doormat is something on the outside. For instance, let's say in the workplace, someone does something and continually does something. Well, there has to be some boundaries set up. There has to be some discipline that is exercised at that. Mm-hmm. But by the same token, you can't become bitter. Mm-hmm. If you become bitter, then your judgment goes out the window, mm-hmm. and you see life. There are people just see life through an angry spirit, a bitter mm-hmm. spirit, mm-hmm. and it's a stronghold that you were talking about, David.
Sammy, I think that there really is, and it's a challenge. I mean, it's only the Spirit of God can give to leadership, spiritual leadership, the ability as to how to do this, and what it's going to mean in family relationships. But it must be possible, because Paul gave specific examples and instructions to the Corinthian church, mm-hmm. by saying, there is one who is committing immorality, the likes of which it would even cause the Gentiles to be embarrassed. And and he was rebuking them because you're not ashamed of that like you ought to be ashamed of that. He was saying, until that one repents, you need to put that one out of the church, have nothing to do with them. Well, was he saying then, because those measures at that point in time were so severe, was he saying, don't forgive that person, don't forgive that person, don't forgive? He wasn't saying that. You forgive that person. You release that one unto the Lord. You give that one unto the Lord. But there are consequences because of the person's action that you're going to need to follow through on, that is consistent with forgiveness, but it's also consistent with the holiness of God. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think particularly in our country, we can get that all mixed up, that forgiveness means, okay, I just am supposed to start having warm, fuzzy feelings towards somebody who has committed a great crime against my family or against society. To forgive means just all of a sudden, well, it really doesn't matter. It wasn't that big a deal. Come on back in. And there's confusion, I think, at that point. What does grace mean? What is forgiveness? And then what is a standard that the Lord would have us to uphold?
And boy, I think we're talking about something that's critically important, because you can't turn on the TV today. People yell and scream at each other. In debates, there's no more, in my opinion, from what I see on a lot of the news channels and things, it's like there's not even intellectual debate. It's I'm going to yell at you and I'm going to scream because we're so bitter and angry with each other. Anyone who disagrees with us, we become so bitter. And so somehow there's got to be, okay, we administer discipline for our children, I think. The worst thing that can happen to a parent is to administer discipline in anger. Now, discipline has to be administered, but it has to be done in love. And I think that's where this...
And does forgiveness of the child mean you don't discipline the child?
Right.
No.
Right.
You discipline the child even though the child has hurt you, has broken a rule, and we can't help but somehow be personally involved in that or affected by that. But to forgive can also mean that there are consequences.
What about the parent-child relationship? Of course, our kids have needed a lot of forgiveness over the years.
And same, excuse me, it works both ways. We've had to ask them to forgive us too.
Right. That's right. We've
really
had to go to them and say, "Hey, I was wrong, and would you forgive me?" And that sometimes is tough. And I think this is the key. At the root of forgiveness is humility, because first of all, to humble yourself and say, "I need forgiveness." And then to humble yourself to say, hey, were it not for the grace of God, there I go too. So, you have the ability to forgive. And these human relationships, the thing that I keep coming back to in this whole discussion is the cross. I mean, that's where it all flows from. I remember when our kids were just real little and I was watching them out on the playground and thinking, God, I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be a husband. My dad died before we ever got married, and he was sick all of my growing up years, and in and out of hospitals, and so I don't have a mentor in this area, so to speak. My grandparents died before I was born, but God spoke to my heart, and He said, Sammy, look at me, look at me, and see how I've dealt with you. And that's the way you're to be a father. That's the way you're to be a husband. Look at Christ, and when I do, I see right smack in the middle of that whole relationship is the cross. Where forgiveness comes from, and it's not a preachery thing. I mean, it's a real practical thing that at the cross when I talked about that burden being lifted. Not only that, there was transformation, not just a burden falling off, but I was really, and I have been, you talk to my friends, 41 years ago, I was a different person. God changed me that day.
And it's so slippery, Sammy. Sometimes we don't know that it's there. We don't know unforgiveness is there, and even as a believer, and it can take some circumstances coming out to show that the Lord's loving us by allowing certain things to happen. I remember when Shirley and I were early married, there was a season in her life where she went through a real tough, dark time, and I didn't even really know how to help her. I had just gotten a degree from, a large seminary and all that kind of stuff, but I didn't know, I didn't understand it, and there was so much at the root, I think, of what you were walking through that was tied to the importance of forgiving ones in your family, that release that just came. There was a real release that even had physical dimensions and manifestations in that.
That's really true. I keep thinking about the words to a chorus that we sing sometimes that says, I know a place, a wonderful place, where accused and condemned can find mercy and grace, where the wrongs that we have done and the wrongs done to us are laid, and it's at the cross. And at the cross is just as you're saying, it's just so true. It's not just the wrongs that we have done, but the wrongs done to us can be released at the place of the cross.